Whenever you guys are.
Close down or so.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Commission meeting.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Take your time.
Can I never find this?
You didn't print off all 600 pages.
I have it at home.
Okay, got it.
Yep. Today is Monday, November 18th. And to go over the rules of the meeting, I'm going to request Becky Pepper.
Thank you very much. My name is Becky Pepper, and I'll be helping to facilitate the Zoom video portion of the meeting. And I'll work alongside the chair to facilitate the meeting proceedings. And before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping items for this hybrid meeting. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and on cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you're not speaking. The chat function for this meeting is disabled. All chats will go directly to me. Unless you're participating in the meeting, please turn off your video. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting, and then when you are participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble during the meeting, you can send a chat to me. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distraction during the meeting. And so with that, I'll turn the meeting back over to the chair.
Thank you, Becky. Jeff, before I go into the minutes, is there any general meeting item we need to discuss?
None this evening?
Okay. Do we have agreement on the minutes from October 21st and 23rd? Any questions or concerns? If not, can I get a motion?
Move approval of the minutes.
Sorry, Commissioner Eldridge?
I have a concern about the October 23rd
Okay.
minutes, so if we could take them separately, I think.
Okay, sure. Let's, a motion for the October 21st minutes.
Move to approve.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It's unanimous. Go ahead on the.
And on the October 23rd minutes, I would like to have them amended, particularly as it deals with item number 2, I guess. Is that where we approve the land development code?
Looks like that would be item 3. I mean, this is regular agenda. 1, consider approving a request to rezone. 2, consider approving special use permit. 3, consider making a recommendation to adopt the land development code.
So with item number 3, I would like to amend that to say, consider making a recommendation on the adoption of the adoption review draft of the land development code, revised October 21, 2024. Because as you may remember, we had several discussions about the July draft and the October draft, and finally we moved on the October one. So I thought we might just clarify that was what we voted on.
I would second, or I don't know if that's a motion or not, probably not. Yeah, I would actually agree with that revision. I
Do we have any discussion?
Well, I want to clarify, does that strike is accurate to you, Jeff?
I have to watch the video, but I believe that to be correct off the top of my head.
Okay.
I hate to admit this. I did watch the video, and I wasn't looking necessarily for that, but it is correct.
Okay. That's all. I just wanted to make sure that because there were several verses, I just want to make sure we got that right. All right. Cool.
So, Jane, is that a motion then?
That is a motion. I also have a question about the minutes.
Okay.
And my question is, I didn't understand the add owner occupied versus non-owner occupied. What was exactly the thing that we did there?
Owner occupied versus.
That was to update it to mirror and reflect short-term rentals as it's reflected in the current land development code as it is. So you have a non-owner occupied short-term rental and an owner occupied short-term rental. And so the use table just differentiates it based on owner and non-owner. So that just updates the table to match the code.
So it updates the new table to match the old code?
Correct.
Okay. I thought that, but I wasn't sure. Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to just move forward with my...
Sure. Do we have a second? I think you seconded.
I second.
Right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So, you're welcome. Moving back to our regular flow, do we have any reports from the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Organization Policy Board?
No.
Okay. And the Land Development Code has, it's sort of in process, in progress.
Steering committee hasn't been formally retired, I don't think, but our last published meeting occurred the day after the Planning Commission had last month. I don't know if they're keeping it open for some reason, but there's been no activity.
No activity. Thank you. Jeff,
clarity on that
sorry,
one.
go ahead. Sorry.
Steering committee would actually dissolve upon the adoption of the land development code. So it's by the resolution the commission adopted. So it's there until second reading goes through.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Which is approximately timeline wise?
I was still working on the details for that one. Probably be a couple of weeks we anticipate at this
Okay.
point.
All right. Thank you.
Adoption date and the effective date won't be the same, will they?
Correct. The adoption date and the effective date will be two different dates.
Jeff, any written communication from the public?
Excuse me. All of communications that were received by the deadline were included as part of your packet this evening.
Thank you. Any written communication from staff, planning commissioners, or other commissioners?
None this evening.
Thank you. Any written action of waiver requests determinations made by the city engineer?
Also none this evening.
Commissioners, any disclosure of ex parte communications for tonight's items? No.
I don't really, this one number, item number 2 is coming back to us. And to the extent that I spoke with anyone about it, it would have been when it came in, it would have been any ex parte conversations I had, I would have disclosed the first time around. I haven't talked to anyone since, but
Okay. Thank you.
I don't remember
Yeah.
what the.
Thanks for that. Any abstentions from specific items tonight? No? Okay. All right. This is, we're going to open this up now for general public comment. This is for anything that the public would like to comment on that is not on tonight's agenda. If there is anything like that, please approach the podium, tell us your name, and you have 3 minutes. Or online, Becky, if there's anybody online.
If you're online and like to provide general public comment, please raise your hand or turn on your camera. Okay, I'm not seeing any.
So I'll ask again, anybody in the room for general public comment for something not on tonight's agenda? Seeing none, I'm going to move to tonight's agenda. I'd like to, given that it's gotten dark, and see if we can keep our agenda moving and keep things going. So with that, I'll turn it over to, is it Drew presenting the first item? Thank you.
Department. As mentioned, this is for a conditional use permit located at 1622 East 1550 Road. It is for an equipment storage use with an associated cabler trucking company. It was originally established, this use was originally established in 2003 with a conditional use permit. They're now seeking to continue this use with their new CUP application that you're seeing tonight. This is essentially just renewing the CUP. There's no changes, there's no intensification with this application. So with that, I will just jump right into the 8 factors that we do for review. The first one is for the compliance with the provisions in our code. This standard for equipment storage has 2 standards in our code. The first one is to meet the minimum yard requirement for setbacks. The site still does meet those setback requirements, and there's no changes on the lot. The second standard is that it must be screened by both fencing and landscaping. Both of those are present on the site, so that is satisfactory for us. The second item is for the compatibility with the nearby uses and zonings. There is no changes on the site proposed, and there is no intensification. Most of the uses around the area are various agricultural uses or residential. Number 3 talks about the character of the area. As mentioned, it's mostly agriculture, Ag 1 and Ag 2 zoning. This area is located, the site is located in Tier 3 of the urban growth area. This is noted as not planned to be annexed within Plan 2040's horizon unless there is no other suitable areas. Number 4 is the suitability of the property. Since there is no change in use or intensity, it is good to continue as is. Number 5 is the impacts on the natural environment. The impacts should continue to be minimal. There haven't been any that staff has been aware of. Number 6 is the impact on community facilities. There is no anticipated adverse effect on the surrounding community facilities or infrastructure. Number 7 is a conformance with the comprehensive plan. As noted in previous presentations, the comprehensive plan doesn't directly state any regulations on conditional use permits, but it is, the use is compatible with the nearby zonings and the zoning it is in, so that is recommended to be approved. Finally, number 8 is the limit of the use. Staff is proposing the usual 10-year limit with a 5-year review done by the Douglas County zoning. And staff is also not proposing any hour restrictions on the site. So to wrap up, staff is recommending approval with forwarding it with approval to the Board of County Commissions with 2 conditions. The first condition is review by Douglas County zoning will take place 5 years after adoption. And the second condition is that the conditional use permit will expire after 10 years. Any continued use will require a new conditional use permit submittal. So that is all of my presentation. I know the applicant, Paul Warner, is here and can answer any questions, and I will as well.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you. Would you like to say anything, sir?
Good evening, Paul Warner with Paul Warner Architects. As Drew said, all we're really doing is renewing a CP. It's operated for over 20 years with no complaints, so I think that kind of speaks for itself, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We'll get back to you if there are any. Thank you. Anybody in the public that would like to comment on this issue? Anybody online, Becky?
No, not seeing anyone online.
Okay, I'm going to bring it back to the commission to see if there are any questions for the applicant or for Drew. Go ahead, Commissioner Eldridge.
I have a question for Drew. Last month, when we looked at a CUP for equipment storage, that was equipment storage that was heavy, and this one isn't identified as whether it's heavy or not. But the last month, there was a condition that there would be a life safety inspection. And what's the difference between the 2 CUPs for heavy storage that we've looked at? One needs a life safety inspection and one doesn't.
I am not sure about that standard. I don't know if I was on that one. If you were talking about the storage, that was exterior storage. So that is different than equipment storage. Equipment storage is usually associated with like a use on the site, whereas exterior storage is like RVs and boats and that sort of thing.
No, I think it was equipment storage.
If I remember correctly, I think in that case, there was improvements being made to the inside of a structure, and zoning and codes wanted to ensure that those improvements were meeting the code requirements. And as best as I understand this case, is the building that you're seeing tonight has already met those items and doesn't need that same level of review.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other questions?
I have a
Go ahead.
question for staff. So the applicant addressed this in passing, but wanted to confirm, under the existing CUP, has there been any complaints or concerns with that have arisen in connection with enforcement?
No. So part of the review is we coordinate with the Douglas County zoning codes, who they deal with any kind of complaints in the county with CUPs or site plans, and so they did not note any open cases for that.
Great. Thank you.
I have a question about that.
Go ahead.
Do you know if it's standard for them to reach out to like the township when they do those reviews?
Yes. So this one wasn't in a township. This was it's basically it's just right outside the city limits in Lawrence, and so I don't think there were any township requirements for this, notification requirements.
Wouldn't that be wouldn't that be, if it's right outside the city, wouldn't it be in the township? I mean, there could be other areas, or it could have been right in between 2 different things. I was just curious. I was actually mostly curious if it's just standard operating procedures.
Yes.
To reach out, because that would be a good thing. I don't have any knowledge of this particular one, but I was just curious. Nobody's here, but sometimes the absence of someone doesn't necessarily mean there's no issue. It just means that the people had no idea to bring up an issue. So that's why I was curious.
Yeah. So when we get the submittals, we send out basically a mass email to any townships or county reviewers that would essentially have comments on the project. And I know with one of my CUPs that went last month that was in the Lecompton Township. They emailed me back and said they didn't have any concerns. And so I'm going to look up and see, but I don't believe that I don't know if it did go to a township, I did not hear back from them.
I'm mostly interested if it went to them,
Sure.
rather
Yeah.
than you heard back from them, just
Yeah.
to make sure that they are aware. So thank you. And that would be the county, though, that would send that out, not you.
It would be our
It would-
department.
Oh, okay. It would be somebody, I get confused sometimes when they're city and county, and I'm not sure who it is that sends out the notice, or reaches, that's not a notice, but reaches out to a township in that instance.
It would be the city county planning office, which is us.
Okay.
And it was sent to County Township, and they did not provide any comment to us.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Hayden. Anybody else? Questions?
I'd make a motion to approve if you're ready for that.
Seems like
Second.
we are. Second.
Let me read it. Move to approve the conditional use permit UP 24-1008 for equipment storage use located at 1622 East 1550 Road and forward to the Board of County Commissioners with a recommendation for approval based on the findings and conditions in the staff report.
You second. Any discussion? All in favor, aye.
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 All right.
Seems unanimous. All right, thank you. Item number 2, and I think this is Mary presenting. Please go ahead, Mary.
The share?
Yeah.
Right there, okay, thanks. Mouse doesn't want to do it. Well, good evening, Commissioners. I am Mary Miller, a City County Planner, and this is a text amendment that began in 2023. It was submitted, a request for it was submitted by a property owner in Douglas County, and the County Commission initiated it in August of 2023. It required quite a bit of research, so it did not come before you until March of 2024. This is an amendment to consider whether or not zinc, the zinc that's part of the galvanized coating for the buried piers that support the solar arrays, as corrosion occurs, if the zinc would pose a potential for contamination of groundwater. And so that's what this text amendment is for, is to determine if that's an issue and if there's measures that we should take. The Planning Commission deferred action on this at their March meeting and returned it to staff with direction and asked us to provide additional information along with a redlined version that shows what changes could be made to the regulations. So the Planning Commission direction, they directed us to contact experts, particularly the Kansas Geological Survey, and provide more information on the corrosive environment of the soil, parameters that could indicate a higher degree of soil corrosivity, groundwater contamination, soil testing measures, groundwater testing or monitoring measures, zinc contamination levels, and mitigation measures, so if contamination is identified. So before I get started on that, I'll just briefly go over what our current testing requirements are, the standards that we applied. The ad hoc committee worked with an environmental engineer and an environmental expert on the groundwater testing, and their recommendation was that we do an initial testing of groundwater of wells within 1/4 mile of the site area prior to the installation of the equipment. And that would establish a baseline for the property owners. And this is very similar to what we do with quarries. Before a quarry begins quarrying in a phase, they offer these baseline water tests to people within 1/4 mile. And then we do soil samples. The soil samples are done for 2 purposes. One is to kind of assess the environmental health of the soil. There is some concern that having solar farms over agricultural land might degrade the soil. With our standards, we're required to have plantings, either cover crop or agricultural plantings. And so the idea is that it would help, the rest would help the soil. But the soil samples would also measure if there's any contamination. Most of the solar panels are very tightly sealed, but they do contain materials that could damage and contaminate the soil if they leak. So soil samples and soil testing is required prior to the installation of equipment, after the installation of equipment, prior to renewing a CUP or to beginning decommissioning and reclamation, and then again after decommissioning and reclamation. These are the set intervals. In addition, if panels are damaged to the extent that they leak, soil testing is required, or if a damaged solar panel that isn't leaking is not removed within 30 days, then soil testing is required. So soil testing is looking at that topsoil to see if there is contamination, and it also assesses the environmental health of the soil. And so the expert input, you'll notice in the memo that I used scholarly articles for most of the information that I have. We did reach out to the Kansas Geological Survey scientists. We talked with them in March for that staff report. We reached out to them again with additional questions. The American Galvanizers Association, they provide information on their processes and the length of time they expect before corrosion. They did have a reference article, and that was mentioned in the staff memo. And then we did a survey of the oldest large solar facilities. There is an online database that tells you all the solar facilities, how large, when they were commissioned. And so looking at the oldest large ones, I wanted to see if any of them had identified contamination of zinc. And I did not want to look at the arid areas, the west or the southwest, so I tried to look at Midwestern. I looked at some in Texas, and I did look in the southeast. Those areas are more damp than here. They have more of a marine environment, so it would be a conservative guess to include them because they'd be more likely to have corrosion. And as you'll note in the memo, none of them have identified corrosion to this point. I think the earliest one was installed in 2012, so they're not that horribly old yet. So it's not a conclusive. Had I found that some had identified zinc, that would have been a more conclusive result. So looking at the corrosive environment of the soil, one of the scholarly journals I looked at said that soil as a corrosive environment is probably of greater complexity than any other environment. The corrosion process of buried metal structures are extremely variable and can range from rapid to negligible. And as an example, one of the papers indicated that if you have a zinc-coated item and zinc starts to corrode, oftentimes that zinc will form a patina that then holds on to that material, and it itself prevents corrosion. So this whole idea of corrosion and the soil environment is very complicated. The Kansas Geological Survey scientist, he kind of provided an email that had a lot of information on that. We have mentioned that zinc is very immobile in the soil. It's a homebody. It doesn't want to travel, so it finds something it can connect to and stay put. And he explained in detail all the different types of minerals and things that it would hold on to. And he's noted that after moving with soil moisture, probably no more than several feet from the footing, the concentration of zinc would be expected to be low and not of concern to drinking resources. And so with that information, it's the assumption that we wouldn't be worried about the corrosion of zinc if you were more than several feet from the groundwater. It's going to hold on to items in the soil, and it's not going to migrate. So we're turning our focus, if you have piers that are within a certain distance of the groundwater, that's where that zinc corrosion would be of more concern. And I'll probably mention that several times throughout this. Then looking at the parameters, some of the journals had different parameters. In the memo, I just kind of listed the different parameters that I found. And some of the different journals had like different levels. But soil resistivity, that's how resistant the soil is to electrical currents passing through it. And it's inversely proportional to corrosivity. So if you have a very resistant soil to electrical currents, then it's very resistant, so then it's non-corrosive. And they have tests they can do. They insert items into the soil and they test the resistivity. The pH level, I think we discussed that quite a bit back in March, that those pH levels that give you an idea of corrosion is likely. Other items they mentioned, one was sulfate. The article mentioned that that is primarily a concern for concrete, the corrosion of concrete, but sometimes items act on it and they convert it to another substance. Chloride is related with salt, and that's more of an issue where you have marine environments, or if you have land next to a large road they use salt to de-ice, because that salt can travel over and pollute the land, and that could create more corrosion. Another parameter is a redox potential. I cannot answer any questions on what redox is. I know it's a reduction oxidation, and that's how likely the soil is to give up a particle and how likely something else is to take it, and that's all I understand about that. But it's also inversely proportional with corrosion. And then sulfide. And they noted that if an anaerobic bacteria acts on the sulfate, it converts it to sulfide, and then it's more of a corrosion issue. And the documents did not provide specific levels of sulfate or chloride. To my notes real quick. And so the summary in the memo noted that staff does not feel that I don't have the expertise to develop a set of parameters, or we could say if soil has this and that, this type of pH, that I could set up a standard that we could look at soil and say, don't worry about it, it's not going to cause corrosion, or this will definitely cause corrosion. But if you were interested in that, I think we would have to go with maybe a third party, someone with the expertise that they could give us a set of parameters that we could feel comfortable with. However, as the Kansas Geological Survey scientists noted, we're primarily interested where the piers are within 4 feet of the water. So location may be more of a factor for us than these soil parameters. Where the piers are within a certain location of the groundwater, regardless of what the parameters would tell us, if we were going to do testing, that is where we probably should test. Because that's where the corrosion, if it occurs, would have the potential to enter the groundwater. And so with soil testing measures, we don't have a parameter for corrosivity or zinc movement through the soil. And so I don't have any soil testing measures that I would recommend. As I mentioned, I think looking at the location. If the piers, where they're buried, are within 4 feet of the groundwater level, then that's probably the most logical place to do the testing and the monitoring. And so with the groundwater testing measures, require groundwater monitoring where the piers proposed are within several, and I'm recommending 4, of the groundwater level. And the reason I'm using 4 is because to determine the groundwater level, they would use either the Kansas Geological Survey, they have monitoring wells throughout the county, or they would more than likely use their test wells. And reading the KGS information, you usually do test wells in 3 seasons of the year, spring, summer, and fall. And from what they provided, early summer seems to be when the water is the shallowest. That's when the well is the fullest. And so to determine the groundwater level, we would use that shallowest level. So if you were 4 feet of that level during that wettest period, you would be further away the rest of the year. And the range, as you get farther away. So I think 4 is reasonable. We could look into it and pick another number, but that's a number that I think is appropriate. Testing would be done in the expected downstream area. And hydrology, it's difficult to know exactly where groundwater flows, so they'd have to get an expert to provide their information on that. It would be done between where the piers are, within 4 feet of the groundwater, and nearby residential wells. And testing would be done at 6-month intervals, is what the recommendation would be. As an alternative, in the memo I mentioned a different alternative that doesn't use monitoring wells, is that, and it would be a voluntary alternative, the operator could offer to just test the residential wells within a quarter mile every 6 months. And if zinc contamination rises above a certain level, they would just mitigate it. This would require them to possibly be mitigating zinc levels that did not occur from the solar facility. Zinc contamination could occur. One of the most common sources of zinc in the environment is fertilizer. A common source of zinc in household water is corrosion of the plumbing pipes that are used between the well and the house. It could also occur from runoff of galvanized roofs that run into that area. And that's why that would be a voluntary option. We couldn't require that because we can't require them to mitigate things that they did not create. But I'm listing that as an option. That would be an option that they can propose. Whether it be approved with the CUP, that would depend upon the CUP process. And then finally, to look at the zinc contamination levels and mitigation. Well, EPA sets levels. They have levels for lead, they have levels for mercury. They don't have a level for zinc in water. They do have a secondary standard, and this is for aesthetics. They've set 5 milligrams per liter, and at that point, water would become murky and it might have an off taste. They don't enforce this, but they've noted that the states can enforce it, and I assume that it's logical counties could also enforce it. So in the memo, we mentioned 5 milligrams per liter as being that limit. If you have above that, you should do mitigation. And I checked with the Kansas Water Services website to see what kind of mitigation do you do for zinc contamination. And these are some of the examples. You can do distillation. They show a water purifying system. And this is usually done at the very point of use, like with your faucets. Ion exchange would be a water softener, and the reverse osmosis is kind of a filtration system using pressure to run the water through filters, and these would be whole house mitigation systems. And in the redlined recommendations, we aren't mentioning any specific mitigation because it's logical to assume that corrosion would take a number of years. Some of these that we checked with are 12 years old and there's been no corrosion or no contamination of the groundwater. So it's likely it could be 15 or 20 years before any mitigation is necessary, and the technology, there could be much better technology at that time. So mitigation would be required, but we're not specifically stating just what type of mitigation. So there are two options. One is to make no changes to the zoning regulations, and that would be denying the text amendment. And the other one is to make the changes shown in the red line version in attachment A. And I'll go through those. There's not a lot of them, so that shouldn't take too long. On this screen, I apologize in this presentation, initial testing should be in red. Currently, groundwater testing is just done one time, so there is no initial. It's just the one test. But with the revision, it would be called initial testing. And the things we search for, we would add zinc. These are just examples of what you could look for, but it would be good if we're actually looking for zinc that we list it to make sure that it does get included. And then we would add a section called the ongoing testing and mitigation. And this is pretty much what I've explained. If you're within 4 feet, if the piers are going to be within 4 feet, that's when you do the 6-month testing. And I discussed how the groundwater would be determined by the test wells dug in those 3 seasons. The shallowest level would be the groundwater level. And then the monitoring wells would be placed between that and nearby water wells. And then the samples would be taken every 6 months by an approved testing firm. The next section is kind of a little caveat we always add because the Zoning and Codes Office has to approve the testing firm, but then there's always a route if the operator disagrees with the Zoning and Codes decision on the testing firm, that they can appeal that to the County Commission. So if the zinc contamination in the that when we do the test, if it increases from the initial testing to above 5 milligrams per liter, then the water within a quarter mile would have to be tested. Those well waters would have to be tested. It's possible they would not experience any contamination because as the Kansas Geological Survey scientists mentioned, when the zinc is released, it'll be diluted as it travels. As it moves into more water, it'll be more diluted. So it's possible you could find that you have a contamination level where you have your monitoring well, but you don't have an issue with the residences. So that's why we would want to do these tests. And of course, they're dependent on property owner permission, and the same notification as that earliest well test would be required. So if the tests of the nearby wells show that they have increased to above that 5 milligram per liter, then it would be necessary to do the mitigation. And then this is that alternative that the operator could propose this, that they would just skip the monitoring wells and measure the zinc in the nearby residential wells. So making this change would have us, we'd need more information with the application. The existing condition site plan would have to show us what the general groundwater level is. The proposed condition would have to show the locations where the depth of the piers would be within 4 feet of the groundwater surface at its shallowest level. That would have to be shown on the plan, and also the general placement of the monitoring wells would need to be shown. And in the proposed condition, it would also have to provide a groundwater monitoring testing plan. And this would have to include the studies and information used to determine the location of the monitoring wells, the installation method, the maintenance measures, the sampling and testing methods, and abandonment and reclamation measures. And so those would be the changes that would be made with the regulations. So staff's recommendation is not changed from March. I don't find that there's been enough evidence to warrant this, so staff is just recommending that we forward this to the county commission with a recommendation for denial. But I mentioned you have the two options. You can recommend denial, or you could recommend that the text amendment be adopted with the revised language shown in attachment A, or with your changes if you want to make changes at this meeting today.
The people she talked to, the different solar facilities she talked to, how did they test for that? Do they have test wells on their sites to know that they didn't have any zinc or any problems with the zinc? You know, that's something I would like to know on that. Also, nothing has been said about or brought up that on this 800 acres, actually 1,000 acres, but I'm figuring 800 acres is where the piers would be in at. So you've got 172,000 piers that are going to be on that 800 acres. And this is a new deal. Nobody's tested for zinc in a confined area like that. So if those piers are on 10-foot centers or 20-foot, just say 20-foot centers, just to be even on it. So if you put that in a round circle, then that 20-foot is going to be touching that diameter for the next pier. So if it migrated out, just a chance of it migrating out 10 foot. So it's going to be touching. You're going to have zinc spread all over because of that diameter. You know, who wants to take a chance about that? And also on the way that they're going to install these piers, I've got drill logs that show in this area, in this 2 square mile area, basically, almost all of it has sandstone. So if you, one of the wells, they hit water at 3 foot, but right below that they were hitting sandstone. They went down. When they drill wells like that, you can have water, a static water table at 3 foot, 6 foot, 10 foot, but they go down 100 foot and that acts like a reservoir. You know, so because a lot of these wells only put out 2.5 to 3 gallons a minute. And so if they're going to be feeding or watering livestock, they may not, that well wouldn't produce enough water to keep up with the flow of livestock. So that's the reason why they go down deeper. So when they drive these piers in the ground, it's going to go down through sandstone. And you've got brown sandstone, which is more abrasive than the yellow sandstone. And that's going to rupture the integrity of that galvanized. It's the same way if you paint something, if you scratch it, it's going to accelerate that paint coming off or the rust. That's the same thing that's going to happen with this galvanized when they drive it down through the sandstone. And some of the drill logs will show where the sandstone could be as much as 4 or 5 foot thick driving down through there. So you're going to have a problem there. That's going to accelerate the corrosion process on these piers. And if anyone want to look at the drill logs, I've got those here for this location, for this area. There it is. So I guess the reason why I brought this text amendment up in the very beginning is when I was in high school, I worked at a steel plant my summers, and then when I got out of high school, I worked there for another year before I went into the Navy. and they were doing water treatment plants down in Texas. And what they did is all the railing that went on the outside of the tanks and the gangways and everything else was galvanized. And we had to follow OSHA's rules when we were welding on them, grinding on them. We had to wear respirators. Unless you were welding outside, that was ventilated. Inside, the plant had to be ventilated, had to have large exhaust fans because that toxic fumes coming off that galvanized as it's being welded. So the bottom line is this was set up to protect the residents out there. It may not ever happen. You know, their wells may not get contaminated, but who wants to take a chance? You know, I mean, not a one of you up there going to want to drink water that tastes like metal. You know, so, and granted, if the operators of the solar facility would want to buy everybody a water filtration deal like what Mary had up here, I think that might suffice. But the thing is, you still have water table that's getting contaminated. And the other thing is, in part of this that I read, is they were going by the water table fluctuates. Well, that information was taken on areas down by the Call River. So it is going to fluctuate because the river fluctuates. Where we live down there, it's elevated, and that water stays right at that same level all the time. People would be up a creek if that water fluctuated and their well went dry. And that doesn't happen out there unless you pump too much of it out, and then it recovers. So that fluctuating water table may be good for down there, but it's not good for where we're at. So I won't go on anymore. I know everybody's kind of wanting to go, but that's the total of this. It's just that it's for safety. Who wants to take a chance? Even though, you know, their wells may never get contaminated, why take the chance? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mary, did you have anything to add? Anything to add to what?
Yeah, I think he had a specific question about did they test for the zinc?
Yeah.
And none of those facilities that I checked with did zinc testing. It wasn't an issue that was brought up. They relied on complaints. They're just like our zoning and codes office, and they received no complaints from any area residents that there was anything wrong with their water.
Thank you. Sir, I'll just come back to you. Did you have anything to what Mary just added? Oh, you're good. Okay, she said they didn't have any specific testing for zinc. Specifically answering your question.
Oh, they didn't test.
They did not test. It was based on complaints, and they did not get any complaints regarding zinc. So,
Okay, all right.
thank you. Any public comment on this item? Anybody in the room or anybody online, Becky? Sounds like. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I live out here, you know.
So tell us your name, sir. I'm sorry.
Sure, Travis Hardy. I live out in the area by Dan. And, you know, like he said, that there's going to be a lot of piers in the ground. Definitely not something that Kansas, you know, has seen before. I mean, it's not like a stop sign. You know, as mentioned, 4 foot. My concern with only 4 foot, you know, next to water is, you know, with these facilities, one of the things that is a big deal is runoff. And that's, you know, with the, you know, the applicant in North Lawrence, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going around that. You know, water can, you know, this stuff could run off more than 4 foot. So, I mean, I'd feel more comfortable if we could expand that out a little farther just because of the possibility of runoff if there is contamination down there, you know, running into like a creek or a pond or something like that. You know, 4 foot just seems a little short to me. You know, the thing is, like Dan said, I mean, Savion, you know, the applicant up north, they actually had said in a previous meeting that I was at, they were more than willing to do groundwater testing. I mean, voluntarily said, hey, we'll do this. If we have an applicant that is willing to do this on their own, you know, why not? You know, they're willing to do it. It's just an added protection for the people living out there. You know, better safe than sorry. I mean, I would really just, because if that groundwater gets bad, we're not going to know until it's too late probably, and, we start having health issues. And if they could do testing, every so often, if it's not within, 4 foot or, whatever, if we change the distance, do it a little more, every 2, 3, 5 years, whatever, just periodically just to test that. I mean, just to make sure there's nothing wrong. Like I said, better safe than sorry. Hopefully this never happens and we wouldn't need this, but why not put it in just, if nothing else, peace of mind. That's all I got.
Thank you, sir. Excuse me.
Good evening. My name is Michael Allman in Lawrence. I think one of the most important things, full disclosure, by the way, I sell water purification systems, so in a roundabout way, I might benefit from this. But anyway, I think one of the most important facts that Mary brought up was how there's such a wide variability in soil corrosivity and potential contamination with zinc. So it's a crapshoot wherever you might be. And a lot of it has to do with the level of the water table, seasonal changes. So from what Mr. Fuller said, it seems like a no-brainer to me that as a precautionary principle, you would want to adopt this. Unless you want to be willfully ignorant, which I think would be very unwise for us as a community on any given site. I would encourage you, Mr. Fuller provided you quite a bit of information. Hopefully you read that, but I would encourage you also, if you haven't, there's a formidable data set that Catherine Ellsworth has in your packet. Amazing amount of information there. That should of itself convince anybody that why not test? I'd also would caution you to disregard anything that Mr. Steve Clark might have submitted, claiming that his extensive knowledge in solar qualifies him to talk about groundwater and things of that sort, but he has a familial self-interest in the whole project of the West Gardner Solar as being a member of the Kanoki family, one of the largest landowners for that potential project. So consider the data that's out there, consider the precautionary principle, and I would say testing gives us the information so that we're not just, shooting in there. Oh, and also, I would question that factor of testing 1/4 mile from potential contamination. That may be fine in upland, but I would suggest that if a solar facility is in a river bottom, that you have moving water in a direction. For instance, in the Kansas River north of town, I believe the nut figure is it moves at 2 feet per minute, and it's moving downstream, of course. It's an underground river. So I think testing downstream in a river bottom.
You're at 3 minutes, sir. You're at 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else for public comment? Becky, anybody online?
If you are online and wish to speak during the public comment, please either raise your virtual hand or turn on your camera. All right, Chair, I'm not seeing any.
Okay, thank you. Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the commission for discussion or questions.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Please.
Just to kind of get started? I want to make sure that I understand. We're not talking about a specific project.
No, this would
We're
apply
talking
to
about
any
And
solar.
that one solar project that is already moving through the process, whatever we talk about here tonight will not be retroactive to it. It's already got its own set of rules.
Right.
All we're talking about tonight is how do we want the code to read going forward?
Right, that's
Is that
right.
correct? All right.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Mary, why not test? What's the downside of testing?
Well, in order for me to recommend testing, I have to be able to say there's a reason to test. And so when I look at it and I see that it's very unlikely that contamination might occur, and I see how simple the mitigation is, and zinc is necessary. People are applying zinc to the land all the time. Their fertilizer applies it. If you take the sludge from the wastewater treatment plant, that applies zinc. Zinc just occurs naturally. It's a natural element. So I didn't see any reason to require the testing. I didn't see where I've ever found any occasions of people having their groundwater contaminated by corrosion. I've known that, like KDOT, as I mentioned in March, they don't want you to use galvanized metals, but that's because they want to extend the life of their project as far as possible, and it's those horizontal, like culverts and underground items that would sit in the water. Otherwise, I have found nothing in my research. You're able to look at more than I can, but I would have to be able to tie it directly to the use and say there's a reason to test, because we could test for anything. You know, someone could say, I think someone brought up in the communication, they're worried now that once the zinc corrodes, then the steel would corrode, and we should test for that. And so we have monitoring wells. We put monitoring wells for the sand pit between them and Eudora, because Eudora's source water was right, what they thought was in the flow. So it's completely possible to put in the groundwater, but for me to recommend it, I have to be able to see point to something to say why I would recommend it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What do these pits currently test, Mary? The ones that we have currently? You said there's...
Oh, for the sand pit?
Yeah.
We have a whole list of items that we said we wanted to test. And actually, the city of Eudora provided some of those just to make sure their drinking water stayed safe. And so I see the tests, but I don't read them. But they test for lots, mostly like chloroform, things that would affect human health.
I see.
And I just don't understand why we wouldn't test for all of that in a case like this, where you have the potential, and we don't know the potential. I agree to that. It's unknown. But the potential to affect dozens, hundreds, thousands of people's drinking water, which we all should have by right of our existence, and not to tie it to a specific project, but I'm going to go back to our previous meeting where I asked a Black and Veatch engineer to give an example of what a project of, say, the size of what's going to go that's been approved for North Lawrence, with that many pillars in that shallow of a groundwater system. Tell me what's going to happen in 25 years. And they have no clue. They don't know. And Mary said it too. The oldest one she could find is 12 years. We don't know. And because we don't know, why would we not err on the side of caution? Period.
I was just thinking to make a point of order, that project has not been approved. It is pending.
Okay, right,
in the
that's it,
process
right,
of that.
true.
But it may
I'm
be
sorry, what was the
actually-
point of order? I couldn't hear.
Well, that particular project is in the process of approval, working beyond us.
Right.
But he made conclusions about things that I think it's really clear to know. And so what that does as far as how that would affect this regulation affecting that project, I don't know. I think Mary said when it's submitted for application or gets into the project or whatever, but I just want to be really careful about using any particular project.
Yeah, what I'd understood him to say was just an example of a question he asked during that conversation, trying to relate to it. Yeah. So I guess a question on the why not, and Mary, I get your point, because I mean, where do you stop if on what you test for? I guess there's an obvious possibility if zinc is coming in contact, that might be a thing, as opposed to just any other random thing you might test. So it kind of makes sense that you at least ask the question, but I find myself wondering about the cost. Do we have any sense for what this text amendment might do to the cost of a project over time? What would it cost to do testing every 6 months?
If we're just testing for zinc, I don't know the cost of water tests, but I wouldn't think that'd be extremely expensive. We're just testing for the one item. I would assume it wouldn't be very costly. But that's just my assumption.
I guess I would just sort of question, we have zinc here before us as a question, but if there's really no evidence for that being a problem, where does that stop in terms of we can just keep adding? We'll test for this, and we'll test for that, and we'll test for that, and we'll test for that, if we have no justification for that. So I'm a little hesitant to just willy-nilly say, oh, well, let's just throw everything in there, because who knows what comes up next month, and the month after that, and the month after that, in terms of what we could test for this, and we could test for that. And to the point of other metals coming after the zinc has corroded, I do have a question. So in the materials, I read that the expected lifespan of the zinc on the galvanized steel is 50 years in our soil, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
So I'm just wondering, that's basically one renewal and then another renewal potentially of the use permit.
Right, by the time
Right.
all the zinc would be gone, right.
Right, so I'm thinking as these CUPs come up, there could be added testing in the future. Since this will have to go through two more approvals before the zinc was even,
Right.
where the other metals underneath wouldn't even be exposed in this case. Is that correct?
Yeah, and again, I'm assuming, but I think if the other metal was exposed, that the operator would probably want to replace them. They just don't want their piers
Right.
dissolving, so,
Right.
but then that's just an assumption.
So in the 50 years, you're talking, like the 50 years, that's like assuming no corrosion, though, no penetration, no corrosion, right? So once that's not, once it starts to corrode, it could go faster than the 50 years, right? Because there's a imperfection and now it's starting to corrode versus a solid piece that lasts 50 years. That
It was my understanding that that's the lifespan for a piece of buried metal that's galvanized, regardless, and if you went in and hit it with an axe or something, but, just natural, that it would take that long before the zinc is gone.
I guess I'm just wondering what the corrosion does to that 50 years. If that
That's
makes
when
any sense.
the zinc is there, and it lasts for 50 years.
But if it's exposed to like if it's
No,
corrosive.
that's protecting the metal from corroding, and it will protect the metal from corroding for 50 years, according to the documents.
Even if it's corroded though, and it's, okay, I'm just trying to understand.
always
Once it starts,
reflect, so-
generally once something starts to corrode, right, you can see what's underneath it. So at that point, wouldn't it no longer be doing a 50 years worth of protection? I don't know. All I know is nail. I'm like just thinking about when like, if it started to corrode because of the pounding into the sandstone, things like that, right? Aren't we accelerating the corrosion? Or putting it in like certain environments? Aren't we accelerating that? Is my
It would be,
question.
for instance, if you put it in an acidic environment or
Yeah,
a marsh,
yeah.
something salty, that would speed it up. But I think the document was looking at what our normal
Okay.
conditions are. And zinc is, they decide how thick the layer is based on where it is and what the conditions are. So, and they looked at how thick it was when they were determining how many years it would last. It was real thin, it would last less.
Sorry, I was just trying to figure out how long the 50 years lasted.
50 years is the protection, then it starts to corrode.
And that's
steel.
assuming what types of soil, because what types of soil is that assuming?
Our soil.
Well, okay, so when we say our soil, is that including the corrosive soils that we have in Douglas County? Because there are several places where it says we don't have corrosive soils, but it's been pointed out to us that we do in fact have corrosive soils. So I'm just wondering if they are a part of that, if we can assume that this protection would apply in those areas as well.
We do have corrosive soils, so just the level of corrosivity is considered to be low to medium. And you may find a spot for some reason where salt has ran off the roadways and it's more corrosive. So I think that time frame is pretty reasonable. And I had another point, but I forgot what it was.
You can see the effects of like salt runoff on roadways, on how fast zinc or galvanized culverts collapse, right? They're under every driveway or road, and they probably go a little bit faster than something that's fixed in ground, particularly if it's driven into sandstone, which I would think would not only pose a risk of damaging it, but also protect the area that was damaged because it's now encased in the ground.
And you've said that when it sits in water, there's more concern for faster corrosion, correct?
Correct. The piers that are in the water. That's why if you're within 4 feet or if you're ever submerged in the groundwater, that's when corrosion would be most likely to happen. I don't think anyone's really concerned about corrosion elsewhere. You know, if you're not close to the groundwater and zinc corrodes, it's just going to catch on to other things and sit there and be available for the crops or for whatever. There's not a health risk with having it in your soil. We actually are putting in the soil all the time. But it's where you're close to the groundwater, and that's why I didn't really stress a lot of the corrosivity issues or the parameters, because I think locational is more important. If you're within 4 feet of the groundwater, and if you're worried about zinc getting into the groundwater, those would be the areas that you would look at without making any, it wouldn't be necessary to test the soil to say, well, we don't want to look at that piece, but we're going to look at this piece. I think then we'd be getting a lot of studies and a lot of details when it would just be easier if you were going to look at it, say, wherever it's within 4 feet of groundwater, regardless of how corrosive the soil is. Because you're not really measuring soil at that point. You'd be 4 feet down. So the nice topsoil, or like what the web soil survey tells us, down below it'll be much different. You know, your soil quality will be different. So you'll have to do actual tests regardless.
We've seen some designs where they will actually be in the water table, close to the water, and I just don't see why we wouldn't require monitoring in situations in our county where we know the soil has the high acidity, or where we know that the water table is at these levels where it begins to raise concerns. So no, I get not everywhere or making it mandatory for every project, because it might not be applicable to every project, but it seems like we have enough places in the county where if it meets that locational standard, then why wouldn't we require monitoring? I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking.
So would you then suggest that we would have to, a certain level of, then we'd have to have in here we'd test when the soil acidity level was at this level?
Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely. Like, I'm not saying I have the scientific knowledge of knowing what those levels are, but it would seem to me that if we know that there are citizens here who are at risk potentially more than others, then we would want to protect them in the sense of saying, in these kind of areas with this soil or with this level of our groundwater, that we would take care of those citizens, but minimize any cost in having any kind of blanket to everybody who has a project, right? I'm not for everyone who has a project, just areas in which we know that this might be a concern, which it sounds like we would have that data. There was a study from a project that came before, and the experts hired in that case specifically raised this issue and said that this needed to be looked at. And so in that instance, right, I think that there's a lot here.
I remember, I'm sorry, I just want to add on to what you're saying. I remember when that last solar project came through, we addressed the question of zinc, the possibility of zinc erosion. And we said, if I remember right, we said that, let's get specific about the conditions where we would require testing. And we said where resistivity is above X, I can't remember exactly what the number was, and pH was below Y, and I think it was 5.5. Or if a piling was going into groundwater, knowingly going into water, that if it hit any one of those three conditions, that we would test.
Well, I don't know. Well, yes, and I will say I don't know that is a condition actually with that particular project, right? But I think things like that should just be an automatic known, like instead of having it have to be a condition of a CUP, having it known in the regulations so that when people are going through the process, right?
Yeah.
Just like with other things. But it would be something like that.
I
Like,
was just referencing that,
Yes.
'cause I thought that we had actually added that in. Maybe we didn't, I just remember that wrong. But I remember that specific conversation, that we flagged that, and I thought we had agreement largely across the commission that, okay, yeah, I mean, this is what the information says, creates a condition where accelerated corrosion might exist.
yeah, and that might.
And if yes, then, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Then it would be a, well, why not? As opposed to just a more general, let's test for, anything everywhere.
Right. But that's not the language that I'm looking at here.
No.
No, it's not. No, it's not. No.
Yeah, the
No.
text amendment that's
Yes.
presented is
No,
very
absolutely.
different than that, yeah.
Yes. No, and I think that also, I'm interested in the sand pit. When you said that the decision was made to do the monitoring for the sand pit, were there particular concerns that spoke to exactly why, whatever it is that's in that list, like each one of those, were they tied to an element of a very specific thing for that area? Or how did that list come about? Because it seems to me like there are more, if we're doing groundwater monitoring, it would seem like we would be monitoring for more than just zinc. And so I was just curious as to the sand pit that you referenced, how they selected.
Eudora selected it because they did not want to put a treatment plant in for their water wells to serve the city, so they did not want things that you could not have for people. So they just gave us a list of parameters, and we use those. That's what they test for. So Eudora has a groundwater source protection plan, and the sand pit fell in that. It's just a bunch of recommendations, but they were concerned primarily with things such as there could be agricultural spray, because they're going to be into the groundwater where they do their dredging. There could be agricultural overspray. There could be oil leaking from the dredge. Those were their primary concerns, because that's what would get into it from a sand pit. So they did not look at other things. But while they're doing these tests to make sure there's no impurities, they just added all that because it's good for them to know. And when the Rural Water District came to the meetings, they said the primary source of contamination that they were concerned with were the septic systems, because they so often fail and they get into the groundwater. And so they agreed with all the parameters, but this test wasn't going to pick up the septic systems because the wells weren't on the other side of any septic systems.
Mary, if we, sorry, go ahead.
Nope, go ahead.
If we think about this as a CUP requirement, how would that, would the planning department propose that as part of the CUP, if it was in an area that was particularly, near water? Or would that be something that we would flag and say, hey, have you guys looked at the groundwater in this site? Where would that come from?
If the regulations and the attachment were adopted, they would give us a plan that would show us where the groundwater, how deep the groundwater is. And so we would have an idea of what their shallowest groundwater is in that area. And then they would show us where piers are planned to be within 4 feet. And so that's where we would look.
But so let me understand that. But if we deny the text amendment, then that wouldn't come into play.
It always can when a CUP comes
So
before.
that's what I'm asking is, if we deny the text amendment, I'm just sort of playing this out,
It's just that
and something came to us, would you guys flag that and say this is something that needs special attention?
I don't know if we would flag it, because I don't know what there would be to make
Yeah.
us think zinc would be more important
Sure.
here than anywhere else. It might be something that members of the public bring up.
Right,
Or some of you might mention,
Right.
but it's not.
Because you are not flagging zinc as a problem, basically. I mean, you're essentially saying, through your research, you've determined that zinc isn't a problem.
I haven't seen any evidence. that
Haven't seen
it is
any
a problem,
evidence
right.
that zinc from solar,
And so I wouldn't be able to look at an application
right,
and say, I think this one's going to have zinc problems. I mean,
right.
like you say, you could get all the soil tests, and
Right.
if we ask them to do them down low, so we're not just testing the topsoil, we might know where corrosion might be an issue. But as far as will that contaminate the groundwater, we have to know where the groundwater is, because if it's not close to groundwater, it's not going to contaminate it.
But all of that data would be able to be collected by the applicant, and I think we've seen some applications where they have provided that data, right? So this could be a known thing at the application stage or process or something.
You could decide how how far apart you want them to take soil samples, so we have a good idea of just what the soil corrosivity is over the entire area where the solar panels are going to be located. And you can make some determination as to what corrosivity level would raise concern for you, and also what distance it is from the groundwater, if you're just concerned with zinc being released into the soil, or are you concerned with it being released as a groundwater? These are things you could add.
I have a question. So how would, in practical terms, in order to detect any change in zinc due to the solar panels and the piers, I mean, there would have to be an initial testing then?
Yes.
Of all the potential areas where one might suspect corrosivity. So there would have, because otherwise you don't know where, if that zinc is because of the solar panels or it's because of the fertilizer in the area.
Right. If you were going to do the testing, you'd want to do an initial test before anything gets installed, because very likely you could have 3 milligrams a liter just because of all the agricultural fertilizer. And that way you know that 2 more and they have to do mitigation. And they would have to mitigate it back to the 3, or they may be willing to go to 0, but they would have to mitigate whatever they added to the zinc.
So that would involve a testing of specific areas where, well, in the scenario we're building now, in terms of this is where it might be a problem. So we're going to test here, here, there, and there. And so we'll have to have an initial test, and then there would be this, however we would decide, 6 months, year, whatever, annually testing. Because I didn't see an initial test.
I think it's in there, but
Well, the initial test
prior to
for-
installation,
So, but that would be like pier by pier then?
no, not pier by
no,
pier.
not by
I
pier
think
by-
it'd be like in an area, because if it corrodes and releases a little zinc, you're probably not going to catch it with a test. You want to go where they all are and where they drain to, so then you're going to get all of them, and you can see, has zinc entered the groundwater here?
Gotcha.
It'd be like a soil sample test that you do. You pick a space, right? You test it, and then you monitor that over time, right? I mean, they would decide where was the best place.
That expert would look at, okay, here's where the
Yeah.
piers are close to water,
So we
here's
just-
how we think the groundwater flows, here's where we would put the pier, or the test.
So this is, the test shall analyze the water in nearby wells. That's the initial testing.
Oh, that's just the initial groundwater testing that we have
That's the
today. The
initial
next one about the ongoing, it should have where we test when we install, prior to installation.
Mary, I want to ask a dumb question. So, I mean, the reason the public are raising this and the reason we're having this discussion is because of health concerns, right?
No.
Or because of concern that zinc would contaminate or whatever, you know.
Right.
Right? So
Water quality.
the water quality. So my question is if your research has shown that that zinc is not something that we should be concerned about, and if all we're testing is a zinc, I wonder if it's going to be of any value. Like, we should be looking at water quality in general, not whether zinc. Because what I'm trying to get at is like, why do we want to focus on zinc if there's no evidence to point to zinc as a problem? Like, why not just look at this water you know what I'm saying? I mean,
I think because zinc can be tied to the solar farm, but if we test it for some sort of bacteria that's not tied to the solar farm, you could be doing a lot of good, but it doesn't really relate to the solar farm
Right.
in any way.
But I mean, like, what are we going to? What purpose are we serving by testing for zinc? Because I don't know that it furthers public health, or that's what I'm trying to get at. You know?
Well, I think looking at it from the property owner's viewpoint,
Yeah.
if they have nice, clear, fresh tasting water now, they don't want a solar farm
Sure.
to come in, and then they have murky water.
Sure.
And if we do the testing, I mean, if we don't do the testing, their water turns murky, it always could be caused by something else, and they just
Yes.
have to deal with it. But if
Yes.
you do the testing, and we say, well, at this point, it is elevated, and it wasn't before, now your water is murky and
Right.
foul tasting, then they have someone to mitigate it.
Sure.
So that's the reason I think there would be testing.
Sure.
So it has been brought up, where would we stop testing? But I think that in debate, that would be a straw man. We're introducing 170,000 or 200,000 zinc-covered coated piers into this area. And I don't think any place in Kansas, at least, do we have any project with this many zinc piers put in the ground.
Is that true? Do we know that? Do we?
Where?
Well, in other places, he said Kansas, but like Ohio and Wisconsin.
Oh, gotcha.
Right.
And not
Oh, okay.
specifically Kansas.
Right. So everything that I have read and that you have presented says that zinc does not migrate very far. It latches on to something else.
Yep.
But the oldest data that you were able to find was a 12-year-old, 2012 project where zinc piers were put in the ground.
Right, because solar farms are relatively new. I didn't find any really old
Right.
examples, yeah.
And I think what everybody has said is we hope that that is absolutely true and that nothing would cause a problem. I'm not sure why we wouldn't test. I don't know that we can look at cost. I thought we'd always been told that is out of our purview, whatever the cost of something is. I guess in my own mind, I struggle with thinking nothing I have read or seen says zinc migrates very far. And at the same time, we've never had 200,000 zinc piers put in an area where the water table does change. It does shift. It does go up and down there. I, Charlie Thomas, don't feel comfortable saying, let's not test, let's not do what we need to do to protect the people that are, and I will say, the water moves, so I will say downstream, because that water does flow. If it's 2 feet a minute, whatever the flow rate is. This is the first time I can think that we have introduced something, this many things of one element into the soil. A word change, I don't think zinc corrodes, it degrades. Instead of corroding, it is what is under the zinc that ultimately corrodes, but zinc just degrades. Mm-hmm. So I struggle with how much we should do, but I fall on the side that said I would rather be safe and protecting the people in Douglas County rather than not being safe. And I think there is, for me, and it isn't a health safety issue, it is, if you've ever gone to a place where the water is less than tasty, and we've had that where I used to live. So I fall on the side right now of saying, let's do the test wells. Let's have somebody come in whatever area we will have a solar array, test, see where things are, and then test the wells. Is it a mile? Is it a quarter mile? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how a quarter mile came into the discussion rather than 200 yards or a half a mile or a mile. I don't know where the magic of a quarter mile came from. But at this point, I would fall on the side of anytime we introduce this one element into such a compacted area, I would want to test and make sure we are not hurting the residents of Douglas County.
Would you test everywhere, even if there wasn't groundwater?
I think any field, you'd have to sample the entire area. If that's the element we are putting in the ground, I would test for that. Now,
I know zinc comes from brake pads, zinc comes from from tires, zinc comes from all kinds of things. So it is not just the zinc piers, but what a concentration of zinc there is, I think warrants my saying I would rather have it tested.
Can I ask a quick question? Just to clarify, Gary, Commissioner Bexrod, you had your head turned and I didn't hear you clearly.
Oh, sorry.
No, I apologize. This is not retroactive to the project.
This isn't about any specific project that
This is
may or
moving
may not be
forward.
underway. This is only about the code
That's-
that might apply to future applications.
Future applications. So we can't reference it to that. So that's gone and done. Secondly, I don't know, I know you guys live in the country and I grew up in the country and we had to have groundwater testing done in our hood because basically we had more crops and cattle than we had humans. And there was a lot of iron issues where I grew up. In fact, our well water was pretty gross. We had to have a lot of treatment in our home because everything just turned rust colored, no matter what you did. And when we had the testing done, it was more about those corrosive things like the iron and the things underneath. But I can tell you from how many billions of gallons of fertilizer I've put on crops, there's at least 30 to 35% zinc in every application that you're putting on. So if we're talking about runoff, I understand, but the amount of runoff in a farm-rich community of zinc is insane. But the crazy part is that it only travels a few feet. It cannot travel past that because it attaches to whatever it is. It's not migratory. And so it's the things like the iron and things like that that get into the water and are soluble that move downhill with it. And those are the things that I would be more concerned about. So this amendment, to me, focusing specifically on zinc, isn't covering the gamut. If we want to test for other things, I'm not opposed to saying that. I'm just saying I don't think this particular amendment, as written, attacks the root cause of what I would be concerned about, personally.
I would just like to say, I agree. I would like, my concern isn't just the zinc, but the other stuff that would be entering into the soil and the groundwater from, and I think maybe you helped me say what I was trying to say. So there's the degradation of the zinc that's covering corrosive soil, corrosive material. So what I think I was trying to say earlier was if the zinc begins to be degraded earlier, then the corrosion underneath is coming out quicker than that 50-year time period that we have. That's really what I was trying to get at. And so the degrading zinc versus the corrosion of the heavy metals and things underneath, I think it's the combination of the two that make me want to do this type of testing and testing for more than just the zinc in our soils that are that have a better or higher chance of degrading that zinc. That's kind of what I was trying to say.
And it depends upon whether the piers are pile driven through the various kinds of sandstone, and that is very degrading to zinc, or they are drilled and put in. So, and I don't remember, well, I would just say whatever the companies decide to do, pile driving the piers through sandstone, if that's what we're looking at, is much harsher on the zinc coating than drilling and putting it in, putting them in a pre-drilled hole.
But I think tonight's issue is zinc. I don't think we should go off on trying to figure out everything we're going to test for ever.
Yeah.
Just this text amendment, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
To
go ahead.
Commissioner Hayden's point, it's once it starts to degrade, that's where the concern comes in. And if we're not testing, we'll have no idea if that degrading has started. And at, say, a project gets passed in 10 years from now, and it's a 25-year CUP, and those 25 years are up, and there's been no testing, nobody would have any idea what the state of those pylons would be after the 25 years, if there's no testing.
Yeah, so for like the projects that no one has reported a complaint, there's been no testing required, so they don't actually know if any of the zinc is being degraded. All they know is it hasn't degraded to the point where they're starting to see it in their houses or anywhere where someone would visually be able to tell it's happening and be able to make a complaint, because there's no invisible monitoring of it going on. So they wouldn't know if it's starting to break down and then therefore have the potential to release the more corrosive material underneath. So I do think that zinc testing, while it may not provide us all of the data that we want, it does provide some data to let us know what type of risk the residents are at, because it lets us know if those piles are beginning to degrade.
Right. It gives us a starting point. It's like, oh, now we really do need to be worried about other things besides just the zinc.
Exactly. So it's not just about zinc already existing or about zinc being put on fields for other sources. It's about, are these piles in this source by this particular entity or use of the land causing the zinc to degrade at a rate in which, if we know, we can tell, right, what else might be going on with that project that could lead to water contamination and potentially soil contamination.
I also think we've had the experience of knowing that when things aren't working for people out there who are trying to do projects, we'll hear about it. It's not as if we can't do a text amendment to change it in the future if we need to. And I don't think people in this county are shy about expressing their complaints.
I guess I don't understand what that.
I think, are you saying that,
So I think
say
we have-
this gets passed the way it is tonight, if 10 or 15 years down the road, we realize, oh, hey, guess what, they were right, the zinc is corroding, but now maybe we should be testing for these other things as well, and that could be handled via another text amendment.
Or if
Or
somebody
it's not.
has a project and he says, the only reason I can't do the project is because of this testing, then I think we can look harder at that testing and see what we need to do, if anything, to help him get the project done.
Are you, so I just want to be clear, is your statement saying that you support the text amendment, or you're saying that we don't need to do this text amendment now because we can do it later?
No, I support it now, and I think that we can change. I think it, too, is kind of a living document, and I think we can change it later as we learn more and as we have more experience. But I think this does give us the benefit of the best security that we can have based on what we know now. And it's all subject to amendment.
Can I share some thoughts?
Please go.
So I'm just listening to the conversation. I really appreciate this conversation. A bunch of people a lot smarter than me. One thing we haven't talked a lot about is what the Kansas Geological Survey has said. And Mary went to them and posed the very scenario that we're talking about, and they said that there was no known risk. They're in all their experience and work that they do, and this is what they do, right? This is their life, and they are the experts in our state on this. And they said it's not a problem. Blankly, matter-of-factly, not conditionally, it's not a thing. Piling onto that, no pun intended, there's other facilities out there that do this at scale without trouble. They're not in Kansas, granted, but I don't know that Ohio is remarkably different than Kansas in that regard, in any of these regards. There are instances of this. The other thing I note is the ubiquity of galvanized metal. Every fence post, every culvert that carries all of this water, right, is picking up this same exposure. I add to that the fact that in ag, as Michael was talking about, we're laying zinc down presumably every year and in quantity. I'm not judging that right or wrong. I'm just saying that we are, in fact, doing, that's a known source, right? And it's not a concern in these areas. Granted, it's laying on the top, it's not being driven down in, but we're putting zinc out there in the environment. And it's not a problem because it doesn't move. It doesn't migrate. I haven't heard anybody question that as a question mark. For me, I can't support this text amendment because it asks us to do something that isn't supported by cause, it isn't supported by fact. I worry about adding elements to regulations that aren't supported by fact because, in my judgment, it weakens the code. It doesn't support the code, it weakens the code. What I would be in favor of, though, is knowing that there are conditions where we might be driving zinc-coated pylons into groundwater. That's a different story. And I don't know if this is something that we can even do, but I would love to say, that if it was just me, I would say, I can't support this. But what I would ask staff to do is come back and give us a very simple amendment that says, where pylons come in contact with groundwater, groundwater testing must be done. That I can get 100% behind, right? Because there are some unknowns there. The design life is twice what a CUP is, or 3 times what it is, but still, you're in contact with the thing you want to protect. And if that's the case, then absolutely. But just out anywhere in Douglas County, that this be the rule, regardless whether it's going to come close to groundwater, I just don't see the sense in exposing our regulations that way.
Let me ask Jeff a question. So Jeff, that would require us to deny this and then give you guys more work, or what? How would that proposal work?
If that was the commission's prerogative, I would recommend deferring the item with that direction to follow back with that work. Not necessarily denying the amendment because it's still within the task of it, but just referring it back to us for.
Okay.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Referring it back to us to continue the work and then bring you something to look at the next time we can make that available.
Okay.
Of course.
I just wanted to ask a question because the text amendment, the new language, the way it's written, says that we would test if you're within 4 feet of the groundwater, but you would like it to change and just say if the piers would be.
I would support your language on that, Mary. I'm not trying to pick at that. If you think 4 feet is the right number, then
I can't say I based it on anything super good. So
it's proximity to the groundwater that I'm interested in.
If you wanted to be submerged and we said it was within the groundwater, because the groundwater is going to change, but part of the year it would be within the groundwater. Yeah, that would be a simple change.
I trust you on that language.
So would it only apply if it was within 4, like some?
The way the draft is written, we would only look at where the piers would be within 4 feet of the groundwater.
Okay.
And in those cases, then the monitoring wells would go in because otherwise the zinc is going to migrate just a little ways. It's not going to affect anything.
Yes.
If you're that close to the groundwater,
yes,
it could get into the groundwater.
Okay. And that comes from KGS. They would tell.
They say no. They say don't. It's not a concern. But that language is, if we consider it might be a concern, then I would say just look in those locations.
Okay. I guess what I'm trying to get at is the applicant would know those locations based on topography.
The test wells. They have to do test wells.
They'd have to do test wells. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Where they can give us, like I said, when they submit the application, they'd have to show what the ground level is, groundwater level, and they should give us a table that shows the highest and then the other seasons too, so we kind of know what the fluctuation is.
Okay.
And then they would show us where the piers would be and where they expect them to be within 4 feet. And those are the areas we'd be looking at for groundwater monitoring, not the entire site.
Got it. And in terms of cost, I think this question has been asked. Do you think this adds?
I don't think it adds a lot of cost. If they're doing the test wells anyway, I don't know what it costs to convert those into monitoring wells. I mean.
Okay, they are doing the test wells anyway?
Yeah, they do test wells. I'm sure.
I see.
I can't say that I know personally, but I assume they have. They probably want to know where the groundwater is when they fix properties like these.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
I have a question, though. So groundwater testing, initial testing, so I'm looking through this. So for initial testing, the test shall analyze water in nearby wells for substance lead, cadmium, if we add zinc. So that's the initial testing, but the only testing ongoing and mitigation would be for zinc, as I read this now.
Right.
So none of those other things will be tested for continually, just the zinc.
Right, because the text amendment was concerned with zinc. The groundwater, if you remember, we had the testing for some of those things we did.
Yeah.
I can't remember. It was just
Yeah.
kind of something to help the neighboring property owners, you know.
But so that's, basically, we're testing for the thing that's of least concern.
At least concern.
That's how I'm reading this.
And I think the reason was, when we did this, remember in the committee, we were concerned with things leaking out of the solar panel. And those are the things that might leak. And so we have all the soil testing afterwards to test it early. So
Right.
theoretically, it's not going to get to the groundwater. So as far as-
Could we add those because because now we're concerned, right, about if the initial test was written because we're concerned about things getting out of the panels and leaking, now that we know that we're concerned about something being driven into or nearby the groundwater, right, could we still test for those things and add zinc to be tested in the initial testing, and then when we do the monitoring in these areas, the location where we've identified it with the groundwater we talked about, also test for the ones mentioned, lead and
cadmium.
And zinc.
You could, it doesn't really relate to the piers, but you could add that if you wanted to.
Would it not be, okay,
Where
would
did
there
they-
not be lead? What all materials is the zinc protecting, right? So that we're worried about the corrosive materials underneath.
Steel?
Yeah, like what would we need to be, would there be any testing that would go with any of the corrosion that would be in the materials underneath the galvanized?
No, I mean, just iron, steel.
I assume it's.
Don't look at me,
I
I'm
don't know why I look at the other
fearless,
lawyer. We have no idea.
I know whatever company comes in they're going to have to do test holes in wherever the field is to determine the thickness they're going to need on the zinc piers. Are they going to be H piers or round piers? I mean, that was written up in the stuff we looked at. We don't have any, I don't think we have any control over that. Isn't that correct, Mary?
If you wanted to regulate what kind of shape their piers are, you can. I think the one that came in, or the one I talked to, they're going to use H piers because they're more solid and they get more
Rigidity.
traction to the ground.
And the zinc degrades quicker on those because there's much more area for the degradation of it. Again, I fall on the side that says we've introduced zinc into the soil, and so this amendment talks about it. I think, Michael said he grew up out there where the water was nasty. Well, all of us that have had to drink well water, who knows what we were drinking, and when the health department came out and tested the well water we were drinking, they said, probably shouldn't be drinking that stuff. We're IU. I don't know where we would stop at any point. I see the lead pipe issues all over the country on drinking water, but on this particular thing, zinc is what we are looking at, and I think I agree with Mike when he said pure drinking water, clean drinking water ought to be a human right, and I agree with you. I just don't have any control over that. But the zinc testing, again, I will stick my comments just to that and say I would test it.
I'm fine with testing both the soil and the groundwater. My big concern is the groundwater, and I don't know that we know enough, and it's my understanding that it flows pretty rapidly, and that if it were to get in there, it could go downstream pretty quickly, which is a little bit different than the studies that we saw about the soil and it not migrating very far in the soil. And so I do have more concern about the groundwater. I think the idea of looking at the text amendment that may have the monitoring in areas where we can identify an actual concern, which is close to the groundwater like Mary's identified, I mean, I think that would be a reasonable approach.
So if, maybe just a way to kind of kick us, what if I
Please.
offered a motion that we could discuss?
Let's do that.
And if everybody could kind of help me with this. What if I made a motion that said, move to defer this text amendment with a request that staff return to the Planning Commission a text amendment version which states water testing will be required when piering is within 4 feet of groundwater. Period. And then we can work from there.
That's what it says now, correct?
Yeah.
That's the language today. So if we accepted the language as it is, that's what it says.
Well, I feel silly right now.
Well, but I think that's what she's proposing, or she said.
Summarized without the additional points.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think the current text says within 4 feet of the top of the groundwater, and that kind of confuses me. What's the difference between?
So the highest point that the water will ever be is when they would test the water. So during the wet seasons, the table rises, even if it's just a few feet, they'd use that. So if the pier was here and then the water level's down and that's more than 4 feet, they wouldn't have to test it, right? But no, we're saying you have to test it when it's at its highest, and that makes it within 4 feet of the bottom of the pier.
Thank you.
So I basically just made a motion saying, I just basically argued in favor of saying no to the text amendment, didn't I?
Well, you didn't make a motion. You said, what if I were to make a motion
Okay,
like this?
right.
So-
That's basically
Well,
what
I
I'm
mean-
saying. I feel so silly.
But it's in favor of the text amendment, though, right? I think.
No.
No?
I don't, is that in the red line?
Yes.
Yes.
In the
Oh,
red
I'm
line.
sorry. Okay,
It's in the
yeah.
red line,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It's in favor of the text amendment, yeah.
Now I feel smarter.
Yeah. No, I think it's good to state.
So that motion would be, I'll just make it.
And the within the 4 feet also certainly by default includes any pillars that are literally sitting in the water.
Well, yes,
Yes.
yes,
Okay, all right.
yes. So I make,
I just have a question before you make a
Yeah.
motion. So do I need to take a moment to reread over like what are we voting on exactly? You're going to make a motion, and is it this, or is it going to have a modification
it's a
of this?
deferral,
Okay,
asking them to come back with them, asking staff to come back with a change in the language.
Okay, I was just confused because that confused
But isn't
me.
that what?
But what are we
had?
changing now? Because
We're
the
not
language
changing
you said is already in
Yeah,
there.
this is the language that she has right now.
So the
Oh, are we
red
keeping
is
the exception?
potential new language.
Right.
That we would be adding in.
Which is within 4 feet of
Which is,
the-
yep.
Yeah.
Are we keeping the exceptions, or are they going away?
That's why I'm asking, because I have conversation,
What exceptions?
The subpoints, 1, 2, 3, 4.
I thought there were
That's
5.
subsection 5.
Could we put those back up on the screen?
So I think the options that were provided to us, and we can go in other directions, but one, staff is recommending not making a text amendment. But if we were to make a text amendment, it could include this redlined language.
Which is the 4 feet
Correct.
within 4 feet.
And only tests for zinc. Am I correct?
Yep.
Correct.
In other words, are we changing anything from the red?
Keeping the red.
Now,
What did you-
Commissioner Ashworth, I did see that, and I might want to make it more clearly, but it says samples shall be tested with the installation of the facility, so probably just prior to the installation would be better. So that we're getting that baseline, like you mentioned, in 2(3).
Well, but wouldn't the baseline be right after installation? Because in case the
I don't like the 6.
pounding of the pylons into the ground disturbs anything.
that's why probably it'd be better to do it before. So we're testing, what is it before anything happens solar related at all, I would think.
What we propose annually.
And then test it every 6 months after.
Well, in terms of this, what this red line is, I mean, I'm just struggling a little bit here because throughout all the subcommittee work and through the debate on this commission, one of the things I have adhered to as I go through what these regulations should look like is I have always considered the science. You know, what is it that we need to be doing here? What is of a concern? What are the issues that the community will face with these installations? And I'm having a little trouble just now throwing it out there and saying, well, even though the science tells us this isn't a problem, we're gonna put this in here anyway. That's just not in my nature to do that. As a scientist, I follow the data. I follow the expertise. You know, I looked at what Mary found. I looked at all the other data that was put out. I did my own literature search on this, and I really could find no concerns with this sink. So I get the idea of just throwing that in there, like just in case, but I'm a little hesitant to do that. So.
I guess I respect the science, and I didn't see anything in the science though that made me feel like the science knew or new in this instance, right? With the groundwater and with the, I'm feeling pretty comfortable about the soil and it like not degrading and going far in the soil. But as far as sitting in the groundwater, being a part of the groundwater, I didn't feel like with the amount of, I didn't feel like I heard anything that said, we're cool with this. This won't, this isn't a problem. I heard more of a we don't know yet. These projects aren't old enough.
I didn't read that because I read that as marine environments, salty water, wetlands, certain acidities. So fresh water, I looked at fresh water, and there really wasn't a concern with.
I think KGS said it pretty clear when they said that the flow of water would be slow, and that even if a little zinc were able to enter, we're assuming that every pier is going to degrade all at once, is I think what's happening here. And that's not going to be the case. The ones that are sitting in water, yes, they're probably going to degrade a little bit faster. But if you were to take a poll of my neighborhood, there's probably 250 piers just in my 3-block area, helical sphere, hot dipped, galvanized piers, because all of our foundations suck. I mean, I have 20 around my house alone. And so what KGS is saying, in my opinion, is that because of its slow movement, because it's not dissolvable, it's not just going into the water and going away, it's going to be pulled through the silt from the bottom of the aquifer. And that, to me, is where it's going to be attached, just like it does whenever we spray it on the crops.
I just have real serious concerns about it because of the corrosive nature of some parts of our soil. And we have seen, and we've had conversations about how that's not in Douglas County, that isn't in Douglas County. And we haven't always paid as much attention as I think we should to certain types of soils that we do have here. And we have seen a report recently that pointed out that based on the water tables and the corrosive soils in that particular project area, that this could be a serious concern. And I just feel like in areas like that, not everywhere, not throughout all of Douglas County, but in areas where people could be exposed to this, that's something that the government should monitor and take care of so that they don't have to try to come and get it in as a condition to a CUP, because I think it's very difficult to get a condition to a CUP or a TBU or any of those things versus having a statute or a regulation that already says, hey, we're going to look for these things, make sure things are good before we move on. So that's all.
How in this regulation, if this text amendment went through, how would we differentiate between any zinc inputs from solar panels versus any ag inputs from upstream farming.
Well, we'll have a baseline. If we do the well testing, we'll already have the baseline because it isn't just fertilizer. Lots and lots of things add zinc to the environment. We would know that if we add 200,000 piers and levels go up, reasonably, I think we could attribute it to that. Will the solar people think that is reasonable? Probably not. But I think when we're just adding that one, initially that one element, zinc, to the environment through the piers, to me, again, that warrants, while I do not believe that zinc migrates very far, but we were introducing all of this zinc all at once. And I'm willing to say I'd rather be on the safe side. Let's test it. Let's find out. Hopefully, we won't see any rise in the zinc levels. That would be great. We've already picked out 2 elements up here, well, the red line isn't up there now. The cadmium and what was the other one?
Lead.
Lead. We already picked out 2. Well,
Sharon, what were you going to say?
why those?
Well, the thing is we may be adding these piers, but it's not like that, it's not like nothing else is going to be added to the environment. Fertilizer will still be being applied throughout the 25 years of the lifespan.
Yeah.
We're still going to put other galvanized steel from bridges and trusses and all the other stuff that we put galvanized metal in. So it's not a strict before and after, because zinc levels could rise because of continued fertilizer applications, because of continued migration from landfills, because of continued migration, well, not zinc, but other things. Zinc doesn't go very far. So, but what we might see is a rise in that level because of fertilizer, let's say.
Isn't that part, I don't know. So with the other types of monitoring, how did they account for that? I would assume that has to do with partly with like where they choose the location to do the monitoring and the testing. Anything that where you're having a before and after and you're continuing, the environment's always constantly changing.
So
like the
where does that
sand
zinc
pit,
come from?
like so the sand pit, for instance, right? Like I would imagine that the things they're looking for could also be introduced in other ways, or I don't know, because I don't know the science behind it, but I assume that has to do with where you pick a monitoring, or like we're monitoring the soils, there's some soil monitoring that goes on with some projects. I'm assuming they have not a foolproof, but that they have a scientific way they go about doing creating the monitoring wells to kind of account for some of what we're talking about.
It almost sounds like you're mentioning doing an upstream monitoring well, so you can monitor what happened before the groundwater got to the solar facility. So if something else is contaminating the groundwater, we know before it reaches the solar facility, and then we can groundwater test as it leaves the solar facility and see what the solar farm added to it. Is what it sounds like to me, is if you want to know, did it really come from the solar farm, you almost have to have an upstream monitoring well.
I presumed it meant we were testing if a quarter mile, we didn't just say one direction, it was around the whole thing.
I think it was a downstream, so when the experts tell you, here's where we think the groundwater is flowing, you would test in that direction. And we could test,
I did not think that's what it said.
it says downstream.
I'm just saying that issue isn't unique to this problem, isn't it? Isn't that would be something that would, anytime you're monitoring or have a monitoring well,
But it doesn't
soil, groundwater, other things could be affected. I don't think it was necessarily, I don't know.
I think in this case, it's a little bit different because the item we're looking for is routinely applied. Like with Eudora wanting to make sure they didn't get some sort of coliform, they didn't want to get petroleum, they didn't want to get things that would be from the sand pit, not necessarily, they don't expect it from other places. But in this case, people in the area could be applying zinc as we're testing for it upstream.
Can I just do a quick, if I don't know if this is the right time, but I'm going to ask, can I just do a quick poll of how many are in favor of denying versus wanting to either amend or accept Mary's language? I'm going to start with you, Commissioner Eldridge, if that's okay.
Well,
Are you?
if I understand the question.
Yeah.
I would support the red text amendment.
The red text amendment,
from
okay.
page
Got it.
59 and 60.
Got it, okay. Commissioner Crawford?
Support.
You would be for denial?
Denial.
Commissioner Munch?
I'm still working through it.
Still working through it. Okay, I'll come back to you. Commissioner Rexford?
I can't support it. I don't feel comfortable supporting it as is, and my reasoning, I'm with you. I'm still thinking through a couple things. I do have a sense that where we come close to, and particularly in contact with groundwater,
Yeah.
particularly something of this size, that's a something. Where I'm hesitating now, though, is in the degree to which we respond. Testing every 6 months, I don't get that. I don't understand how many wells, we're going to have put it in between piers, between every pier, between, every row of piers. I guess I would want to know a little bit more about that. Just how big of an impact to a project are we talking about? So I'm still thinking through what that might look like.
Sure.
And would there be another way to go about that?
I think that's fair. I'm also thinking, Commissioner Ashworth, you've decided?
No, not fully, but I'm leaning towards denial.
Okay.
I'm leaning towards approval. I do appreciate what Commissioner Rexford said, and I don't know that I feel super strongly that it needs to be every 6 months. I mean, it seems like coming up with a reasonable timeframe is fine, and then if there are increases, then increasing the frequency of the testing. I think that all would make sense. I'm not trying to be overburdening of every project all throughout the county. So I think some limitations would seem reasonable. I also have an issue with the alternative to groundwater monitoring. I think I would want to know a little bit more about how I think it's 2.6 would operate the alternative to groundwater monitoring wells, just making sure that there wasn't some kind of a situation where
Oh,
there
just
was
do
an
it
out.
do it if there's a need to do it.
Well, no, I'm talking about the alternative to groundwater monitoring. The operator may voluntarily propose regular testing for nearby wells. I guess I just want to make sure, I'd want a little discussion to make sure that would also do what the objective of
The problem with
other
that,
part
according to
is.
Mary, was that you wouldn't know where the zinc came from. So you would put the operator on the hook for stuff that, they may or not be responsible for. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was
Yeah.
just, those were my thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm leaning to support.
Commissioner Kelso,
Certainly we need to support,
the accepting.
yes.
Accepting. Okay. So we know where we are. A few of us are thinking about it. Do we have any other discussion we want to do before I call for a motion?
Well, I'd like to say two things. One is, I really appreciate all the work that Mary has done on this. I think it's a phenomenal amount of work, and I've sort of learned some of it. And I thank you for that. Secondly, I think she has given us two alternatives here that were very good. And I think that if we want to massage that, I don't think we should vote it up or down. I think we should go with the deferral and try to articulate a little more clearly what it is we'd like her to do in addition.
Do you have a proposal on what
Well,
that would look like?
sure. I would say, I would make a motion for deferral and ask her to come back with a testing program that would be somewhat more limited than the one that has been proposed as our text amendment, limiting it so that we could start off anyway with be sure the testing is in the groundwater within the 4 feet of the top of it. And then I think the ongoing testing could be somewhat more limited depending on what we had found. And I think that would really kind of clear those things up, because it's always going to be a question of benefit and burden. Maybe we want the zinc because we want the fertilizer. Maybe we don't want the zinc because we don't want the solar panels. And that is always going to be a balancing act. There's no clear answer for all of it. And we're going to know more as time goes on. Maybe we'll even know more when we learn more about our watersheds. But I think we've got to leave a lot of room to learn more.
Yeah, so one thing I want to say, Commissioner Eldridge, is a lot of work has been done on this. I mean, I think Mary's worked on it for, I don't know, what, Mary, over a year, 2 years?
Yeah, it seems like it.
So I don't know that I want to give her more work at this point. I think she's given us her best sort of advice. So I want that to be stated. If the commission thinks she should go back, that's fine. But I think this is it. I think Mary's coming back to us and saying, guys, I've done the work. Here's what we have two choices. We can either deny it, or if we're not going to deny it, here's what I'm proposing. So I think would that be fair? Or do you think that going back could maybe, I don't know, what are your thoughts?
If you had changes you wanted to see, we could take it back. And I kind of think some illustrations might be helpful, to show, mentioning where the groundwater testing would happen. Sometimes an illustration is better than a lot of words.
Yeah.
So if you had direction, I could take it back again and I would survive.
Go ahead.
I'm just thinking, is there anything that we could do tonight? Because it's already in there about the 4 feet. That's
Yeah.
right there. But let's take, every 6 months, could we at this meeting say, okay, we're only going to do this every other year?
Could we say that? Could we say that?
Could we say that tonight if we were able to
Come to a
agree
consensus.
on it?
Yeah.
Say that again.
So let's say we've got the 4 feet, and there seems to be a general consensus that if we limit the testing to those locations, but then I've heard conversations about, well, maybe every 6 months is a bit excessive. So I think Mary's got the 4 feet that people seem to like, but we'd alter the every 6 months.
Yeah, so here's a suggestion. Just follow the red text. On 2, leave 2 alone, leave I alone. On double I, say something to the effect, groundwater monitoring wells will be installed downstream of the project, because that's what we're worried about. Downstream of the project.
It does. Third sentence.
Yeah.
It says, still expected, wait a minute, where does it say? Okay, where's
Expected downstream flow
Where's the
of
part where it says they're going to be installed between piers?
At the very beginning.
Installed between piers and existing water wells at a quarter mile of facility and expected downstream flow. Okay, all right. On 3, change that from 6 months to annually.
She's suggesting once every 2 years.
I just threw that out.
Once every 2 years.
I have no basis for that.
I'm not more comfortable with
just,
like,
it's just, yeah.
it seems to me like maybe it's every year, the first couple years, and then it goes to less frequently if there's no issues, or.
I would flip that.
Yeah, wouldn't you want it more frequently as
Yeah,
erosion
and then
occurs?
it goes, I meant to say, and then it goes to less frequently if there's no issue.
Yeah.
So start off with more frequent.
Right, but you would expect to see more issues.
Oh, vice versa.
Right.
Moving
Yeah,
forward
yeah.
because
Either
it'll
way.
corrode and.
So at year 25, you might want to be testing more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So should we start with annually?
I like annually a lot better
Annually?
than 6 months.
Annually, okay, annually. Mary, can we change it to annually?
And
Is
that's
it
sub A
more
is
helpful
fine.
for, Mary, is it more helpful for us to sit up here and work through this, or is it more helpful for us to defer and Mary to be able to
No,
work
I
through
think
some
Mary
of
wants to be done
herself?
with this. I honestly do. I'm just reading her face, and I think she wants to be done, so.
Here's what I'll say. I think if we can come to a consensus on some of these modifications as they're written to loosen the chain just a skosh, like 6 months is excessive, working downhill, making sure that we keep in mind that, we're not trying to add more stuff to the language. We're just trying to clarify to keep the groundwater clean.
Right.
I can be much on more board, I can be on board with that type of change versus like, the super strict every 6 months for 25 years. That seems
Yeah.
I as
excessive.
well.
Yeah, I think that's good.
So Commissioner Crawford, your changes would be make it annual?
Make it annual.
Was there any other change you were proposing?
I would say my other question I had about it was, as Mary had mentioned, would it be advantageous to put upstream monitoring first to see where the water coming downhill was to make sure that we could tell? Because again, Commissioner Thomas said, will the solar companies want to take responsibility? No, they won't. But if we had provisions that said upstream water level, or the testing said X here, and then downstream it said X here, and after 15 years, number one was still perfect, but downhill from the solar panels were bad, we could then for sure blame it on them. Right now, the way I feel it's written, maybe I'm wrong, sorry, Mary, it feels as if they would be on the hook, and then what do? Go to litigation over it? Like, who's going to decide that? But if there's upstream first, and then downstream, that we can isolate out the solar field itself, that's much more logical to me.
Did it really say we would only test wells upstream? I thought it said
Downstream.
But did it really say we would only test wells downstream, upstream? I thought it said within a quarter mile.
A quarter mile downstream.
Oh, it did say down, okay.
Yes, and that's
My bad.
where I was hung up.
My
because
bad.
I missed it.
Yeah.
Would the upstream need to be on, say, the upstream side of the project's property, but what if the project goes all the way to the property line? How could we force that upstream if it's not within the project boundaries? Or
All
would
of
we
the
just
well
say
testing
at
is
the
voluntary
absolute
anyway.
edge?
I believe there's always a
Okay. All right, okay. So we want to go
Yeah.
close to the edge as possible upstream.
Yeah, just upstream as
Right.
close to
Yeah.
possible, because that'll give you your baseline regardless. I personally.
Can we add that, Mary?
I'm
So
more-
upstream and
Sorry, Mary, I wasn't trying to be.
Doubling the
Problem, that's a
testing?
good idea.
You could make upstream optional, because it's only for the developer's benefit anyway.
developers benefit.
Initially, right?
Yeah, all of the testing was up to the owner.
Yeah, upstream is optional.
But you have that condition when it hits 5 milligrams per liter. When it hits the threshold, you do an upstream test. That
I
way
think
can-
you want that baseline
I think the
first.
baseline first makes
Yeah.
sense, because again, then you can isolate it very rapidly down to, is this coming from
So this is,
general
this is the
runoff?
one-time baseline test? And if zinc doesn't migrate,
We wouldn't see it.
Right.
That would be proof positive that the science that we're given here is accurate. If it does migrate, we can say, well, it was inconclusive, and we did our best, like Commissioner Kelso said, to just do the preventative maintenance on the front side. I would be much more comfortable with that language.
And I would like to see then the testing increase to every 6 months if it does hit that threshold level.
If
right?
it hits a threshold.
Or I don't even know
I
what
mean,
all the.
I think that would trigger.
What, or
something
maybe
else.
it's before the, maybe it's.
Remediation.
Or maybe it's,
yeah.
well, then
Yes.
maybe it's before, I don't know. I do feel like if we're starting to see an increase or an issue, then we should increase the testing. I don't necessarily have to say when we have to increase it. I would defer to Mary
Yeah,
on
it says
that.
if the test indicated and the zinc levels have increased to more than 5, the operator is responsible for mitigation measures. So that's already in there. And I think that makes perfect sense to then start doing not only additional testing as that occurs, but in that case, they would be required to do mitigation at that point.
And then I don't think we need subparagraph 6 at
No.
all. In fact,
I agree.
No.
No.
What's some paragraph 6 say?
Yeah,
that's
we
an
don't.
alternative.
Alternative.
Yeah, we don't need that.
monitoring.
We don't need that.
Voluntary thing. Yeah. Well, I know I'm much more comfortable trying to isolate that
Yeah.
solar field than,
Mary, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that it's everywhere.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I'm taking notes, so.
Okay.
Do you want us to read us what you have, Mary? And if it's good, we'll just try to get a motion going and,
can I just ask one question before we do?
oh, sure.
Did subparagraph 6, you say as an alternative, is that as an alternative to the 5 paragraphs above it?
That's the way I
Yes,
read it.
that was an alternative to groundwater monitoring. Since our concern is with the quality of drinking water, one way to take care of it without doing any monitoring is to test the groundwater or the wells. And if the wells exceed 5 milligrams per liter, the operator would mitigate. The problem is there's no connection, so it can't be a requirement. So that's why they.
So one version of this might be as simple as paragraph 2 followed by subparagraph 6.
Right. If a conditional use permit came through and that's what the applicant proposes and people accept it, the neighbors accept it, then that could be how that would be handled. They would just test water wells and mitigate regardless of where the zinc came from.
And if we put a time frame in that said annually, I'm just
yeah.
throwing that out there.
Might be easier for the applicant.
One paragraph instead of 5 paragraphs, if it gets at the same thing.
But there's no,
Oversight.
we don't know what the source of the zinc is
Yeah.
in that case.
Because that is going to be wells off-site
Uh-huh.
Right.
as opposed to on the project site.
Codes director's
Yeah.
not involved then either.
Do we,
And we want Jeff to have to do things.
if we drive 200,000 piers into the ground and it changes to 5 milligrams per liter sometime after that, what would we do? We don't,
The aquifer is
assumption would be that event was part of it.
But that is an assumption.
assumption, yeah, because there's no way to tell exactly where the groundwater came from.
I'm just thinking it through.
No, yeah.
And if that happened, then as the applicant, I mean, it didn't come from me, I'll prove it. I'm going to go upstream and test it, and I'm going to show you that it didn't come from here. I'm making this up. They would have some opportunity to.
I think they could do that, though.
They can do that on their
do
own
that
volition.
under the normal. And like, if we were to have it, I mean, I think we would need to get a lot more specific. So it says nearby wells. I mean, I think we'd want to maybe extend it more than a quarter mile. We'd also want to make sure it's all wells, not just some in the area. I mean, there's just a lot, it's a lot more ambiguous than like the steps. And there's also a lot less like county or zoning and codes involvement in that. Like the above gives a little bit more communication between zoning and codes and not work, like they don't have to go do the testing or anything, but at least they're a little bit more.
What is your concern, Gary? Mr. Rexer?
The quarter mile, extending the radius a quarter of a mile on something that's not supposed to migrate more than a couple feet.
I mean, location, what, I guess in my head, I'm just like, okay, if you decide you want to create, somebody comes and they say, okay, we want to do the voluntary program instead. Okay, that's cool, but like, based on this paragraph, I don't really know what the requirements of that voluntary program are, or how to run it, or how to check for it, or how the county's going to, enforce it or be a part of it, whereas it's just a little bit more.
All right, thanks for entertaining that conversation.
Sorry.
Is there any requirement for the number of wells? It could be 2 wells, one upstream, one downstream?
I think that would have to be determined with the CUP.
With the
because that would
CUP,
depend on
yeah.
the groundwater expert saying
sure.
all the water flows this direction. You
Sure.
might just need one, but if
Sure.
they feel that it flows in different areas, you
Sure.
might need more. So I don't think we could at this point say how many wells
Right.
would be needed. But
And that's
Right.
why
Okay.
subparagraph I, or, whatever, the KGS would be involved. And that to me is, important to look at.
Absolutely.
I can
Okay.
support it.
All right, so are we comfortable with the language? Jeff, did you have a question?
Just given the amount of information that you put out there and the variety of different edits in there, what I think I'd recommend is at this point is that we bring you something back to make sure we're capturing it correctly, because we have gone quite in a number of different directions, and I don't know if we got it all 100%. So we want to make sure we've got it right and bring it back to you before we proceed.
Sorry, Mary.
That's okay.
Sounds okay.
I would just like to say thank you for that, because I do feel like it's really important, and I don't want to give Mary extra work by any means, but I do think hearing all of us talk and throw information, if I were drafting this, I would want a moment of silence with my work product to kind of work on this. So thank you for doing that.
So we want a motion to defer?
We have one.
I made a clumsy one, or did you make one? Oh, I'm sorry.
We were out of order. There was a motion pending the whole time.
Okay.
Anybody second that motion?
Second.
Second, to defer, sorry.
To defer.
Do we need some language around the deferral, though?
Well, the point of order was, I think Commissioner Eldridge's motion was to limit the program. And I don't know if her motion meets the intent of the discussion that just occurred with the commission.
Right.
So it may need to be withdrawn and revised to meet the commission's intent if that discussion was to feed into that motion.
I could offer a substitute motion to limit the proposed text amendment in the ways that we had described collectively and which I believe can be summarized. Oops. Uh-oh. By someone else, because I keep losing it.
Nice. I like it.
I can make a shot at it.
Thank you.
That we would leave 2 alone. I would have no change. 2, or double I would have no change. 3 would be every annually. Sorry, I'm getting these numbers numbered wrong. Subtext A would stay the same. Subtext 4 would stay the same. Subtext 5, was there any discussion on what the mitigation should be before I move forward? Are we okay with that? Subtext 5 would stay the same, and we would remove the alternative groundwater.
Commissioner Crawford, what about the upstream?
Yes, thank you. And on subtext 2, we would add additional requirements for initial upstream testing in an effort to determine where future,
In order to provide a baseline.
in order to provide a baseline for future testing. Sorry. I did not have that language well written in my brain.
I think we also said we'd increase the testing if it hit some type of a level.
That was my question on subtext 5, was if the test of the nearby wells indicate that the zinc levels have increased from the initial test to more than 5 milligrams per liter, the operator is responsible for mitigation measures at the point of use nearby water wells. This mitigation measures shall be noted with the application and shall be considered as part of the conditional permit.
I thought we maybe wanted to at least consider then having testing more than just every year if we already know that.
Yes, that's correct. If zinc levels have increased above the initial test level to more than 5 milligrams per liter, we would require testing on a 6-month basis. Correct?
I think so. I mean, close on
Sorry.
some basis.
Question, so to the extent that we're going to require upstream testing, wouldn't that be throughout the whole process, not just at the initial application?
And it was going to be optional, right? You're going to keep that optional? Or do we?
Yeah, because it's to protect the operator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they could presumably test it as often as they wanted.
Correct.
Right.
So that's the motion, I think.
I like it.
In all of its glory.
I like it.
I will second that motion.
You guys have it? Do you think, Jeff?
I think so.
You think you have it? Okay, Mary? Okay.
You could read through my terrible reinterpretation of that. Sorry.
I think you did a good job.
We will bring it back for you to fact check us on that one. Make sure we got all captured.
All right. I will, and you've seconded, somebody seconded it?
I did.
Oh, you're second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so I think, anybody against it? Any, no votes? I don't think no
Not
votes.
no on a deferral.
Right. All right, so Jeff, any other items to discuss tonight? I think you said no.
None this evening.
Okay, so can I get a motion to defer our meeting to Wednesday?
Recess.
Recess our meeting to Wednesday.
So moved.
Recess. Okay. Seconded?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Good night. Thank you, folks. Thanks to the public. Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Denny, the master.
God forbid.
Thank you, commissioners.